March 11th, 2011. In just a few hours, Japan was dragged into one of the darkest days in its modern history. The ground roared. Cities shook. Buildings collapsed. People ran for their lives. But that earthquake was still not the most terrifying part. Minutes later, the ocean rose into a monstrous wall of water, swallowing entire neighborhoods and erasing families in moments. Then came Fukushima. Explosions, radiation, and a disaster that no longer threatened only Japan, but terrified the world. This was not one catastrophe. It was a chain reaction of terror. And to understand how it all began, we have to go back to the first warning. The first warning signs appeared on March 9th, 2011. At 11:45 a.m., a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck off the coast of Sanriku. That same day, the region was hit by 3 more earthquakes, each stronger than magnitude 6.0. But life quickly returned to normal. No one knew it was only the first warning, before the real disaster began.
March 2011.
On March 11th, 2011, at 2:45 p.m., Japan's early warning system detected the first seismic waves and issued an emergency alert. Bullet trains stopped. Factories shut down. Schools ordered children to take cover. But that window of time was too short. Just 1 minute later, the ground began to shake violently.
March 2011.
At 2:46 p.m., a magnitude 9.1 undersea megathrust earthquake struck off Tohoku at a depth of about 18 miles, with its epicenter roughly 45 miles east of the Oshika Peninsula. The tremors spread across Japan. Kurihara, Miyagi, experienced the strongest shaking at intensity 7 on the JMA scale. But Iwate, Fukushima, Ibaraki, Tochigi, and even Tokyo were violently shaken as well. Outside Japan, parts of China, Russia, and Taiwan also felt the quake. The earthquake was so powerful that seismic instruments around the world recorded it. The Earth's axis shifted by about 7 inches. And for 6 endless minutes, the ground did not stop shaking. As the shaking began to ease, many believed they had survived the worst. But they were wrong. Beneath the ocean, centuries of pressure had just turned the sea into a gigantic weapon. The earthquake did not only destroy what stood on land. The main island of Honshu was pushed about 7.9 feet eastward, while parts of the coastline sank nearly 3 feet. Older structures were badly damaged. Oil refineries caught fire. The Cosmo oil refinery burned for days. Nearly 200 people were killed by the earthquake itself. Initial damage was estimated at around $200 billion.
March 2011.
Only minutes later, the sea began to rise unnaturally. At 2:49 p.m., the Japan Meteorological Agency issued a tsunami warning. At first, the maximum wave height was estimated at 20 feet. But a GPS buoy off Iwate quickly revealed a far more terrifying truth. Sea levels were rising faster and higher than expected. This was no longer a wave. It was a wall of water. The warning was raised to more than 33 feet in Miyagi and 20 feet in Iwate and Fukushima. But even those numbers still did not fully describe the true scale of what was coming.
March 2011.
At 3:21 p.m., a 26-foot wave slammed into Miyako, Iwate Prefecture. The Sanriku coastline, with its deep V-shaped bays, amplified the tsunami's power, causing it to strike earlier and more violently. The bitter irony was that this region had already suffered tsunamis in 1933 and 1960, so seawalls had been built long before. But on March 11th, 2011, those walls were not enough. Water surged inland, tossing cars, boats, and houses like toys. In just seconds, entire neighborhoods were swallowed. At 3:22 p.m., the tsunami swept from Aomori down to Chiba. every town in its path was devastated. In Rikuzen Takata, waves rose as high as a 3-story building. At Kamaishi Nitaro, the water reached 124 feet. And at Annayoshi, it climbed to nearly 131 feet. This was the highest tsunami ever recorded in Japan. For many people, that meant there was nowhere left to run and no time left to escape.
March
At
2011.
3:25 p.m., water surged deeper into coastal towns. Kuji and southern Ofunato were among the hardest hit, along a 420-mile stretch of coastline. From Hokkaido to Oarai in Ibaraki, devastation unfolded within the first hour after the quake. At one school, about 200 people had taken shelter after the quake. They believed the worst was over. But then the tsunami hit, tearing through the building and sweeping away everything in its path. In the chaos, David Shum risked his life trying to save children struggling in the water. But not everyone could be saved. That day, there were 108 people at the school, and 74 students and staff members were killed. This was the moment when the disaster stopped being a story of earthquakes or maps. It became a story about people, about families, about children who survived the quake only to be taken by the sea minutes later.
March 2011.
30 minutes after the major waves struck the towns, the water began to recede. But the retreating water moved with nearly the same force as the flood, dragging away cars, debris, collapsed homes, and even people who had clung on in desperation. It was then that people truly understood the scale of the catastrophe. Low-lying areas remained underwater. Rescue operations were nearly impossible. Entire towns had vanished, leaving behind only black mud, silence, and shattered lives. By the end of March 11th, 2011, more than 18,000 people were dead, and thousands of bodies were never recovered. In some places, morgues were already full, and more painfully, there were not enough living people left to care for the dead. But the disaster did not stop in Japan. The tsunami kept racing across the Pacific at nearly 500 miles per hour, striking Hawaii, the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and then California and Oregon. In Crescent City, the tsunami destroyed the harbor and caused about $25 to $30 million in damage. In Santa Cruz, dozens of boats sank, and losses exceeded $17 million. After 18 hours, the tsunami even reached Antarctica. But while the world was still in shock over the tsunami, another, even more dangerous disaster was unfolding at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The plant was located in Okuma and Futaba in Fukushima Prefecture. When the earthquake struck at 2:46 p.m., the plant lost its main power supply and switched to emergency diesel generators to keep the reactors cool. But just 55 minutes later, a 49-foot tsunami overtopped the plant's 19-foot seawall, flooding the electrical systems and backup generators. The plant was plunged into total darkness. Cooling stopped. Temperatures inside the reactors began rising rapidly. At that moment, the engineers understood the situation was out of control. The Japanese government immediately ordered evacuations around the plant, then quickly expanded the evacuation zone as radiation levels surged.
March
At
2011.
7:30 p.m. on March 11th, 2011, engineers were still desperately trying to reduce pressure inside the reactors. But by the next morning, temperatures had reached critical levels, and internal components had begun to melt. On March 12th, 2011, at 3:36 p.m., Unit 1 exploded. On March 14th, 2011, at 11:01 a.m., Unit 3 exploded even more violently. On March 15th, 2011, Unit 2 released large amounts of radioactive gases, producing the highest radiation levels of the disaster. That same day, Unit 4 caught fire, releasing more radioactive material into the atmosphere. By then, Fukushima had become a full-scale nuclear disaster. But while many were forced to leave, a small group of engineers and workers remained inside the plant, trying to keep the reactors from collapsing completely. The world would later know them as the Fukushima 50. Without them, Fukushima could have become far worse. But outside the exclusion zone, personal tragedies continued. Naoya Kimura lost his father, his wife, and his youngest daughter, 7-year-old Yuna, in the tsunami. 6 months later, the shoe Yuna wore that day was finally found. More than 10 years later, the remains of 111 people who died in Okuma had been recovered. All of them, except Yuna. By March 20th, 2011, power had been partially restored to the plant. But it took several more weeks before the cooling systems were fully operational again. Radiation spread across Japan and even reached the United States and Europe. TEPCO later admitted that more than 10,000 tons of contaminated water had leaked into the ocean, and more than 100,000 people were displaced. Fukushima became the costliest nuclear accident in history, and the 2011 Tohoku disaster became the costliest natural disaster in human history, with total damage reaching $235 billion. More than 120,000 buildings were reduced to rubble. Nearly 20,000 lives were lost. And for years, debris from Japan continued washing ashore on North American coastlines as a haunting reminder of that day. Japan rose again. Roads were rebuilt. Cities were rebuilt. But some things never returned to what they had been before. Because March 11th, 2011 did not leave only a scar on Japan's land. It left a scar on the memory of the world. A reminder that humanity can build the most modern cities and the most advanced warning systems, and still never fully control nature. In just a few short hours, an ordinary Friday ended in earthquakes, tsunamis, radiation, ruins, and tens of thousands of lives torn from this world. Japan survived, but no one who lived through that day remained the same person afterward. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all. The memory of the day the ground roared. The day the ocean rose. And the day the world stood helpless as Japan descended into hell will never disappear.